Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's well on this chilly morning. But to warm our hearts, possibly, is a presentation from Jake Irwin of Hawkins with the title From Non-Stick to Never Gone, the PFAS Story. Possibly a candidate for the best title of the year, certainly in terms of foil events. I think that's quite slick. So well done to Ian for coming up with that. Just a couple of housekeeping points. If you could keep your microphones on mute, it just avoids any unwanted cut through. If you could put questions in the chat, Jake will pick those up afterwards. Please do, just a bit of a plug, please do follow us on social media. Our preferred platform is LinkedIn. I think we do still have an account on Twitter, but LinkedIn is our go-to place for social media, so please do follow us on that if you haven't done so already. And the other thing, just a little plug, is you probably have got your own account on the foil website, because that's probably how you got the invitation for today. But if not, please do go and register your own personal account, create your own password, and then that will also add you to our mailing list for details of future events, as well as giving you access to the member section of the website. So I think that's all I need to say. So I'm just going to pass over to Dr. Jake Irwin.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thank you for the introduction. So today I had a bit of a random request from Ian and Lawrence. I not actually talked really about PFAS in the past. It's not something that's featured greatly in the UK really, and it's quite a good opportunity, I think, to raise it here. It's a topic which has obviously generated a lot of interest in Australia and the US and some parts of Europe, but it's not really come to the fore, I don't think, in the UK yet. So today we're going to go through a little bit of my background, just deal with what are PFAS, some of the history of them, what's kind of the current position, a little bit of toxicology, very high level stuff, very simple, a little bit of regulation, and cover off some of the things about the future. With that, I mean, I guess where we are probably in the litigation landscape. So in my background, I have a PhD in organic chemistry, so I spent my time making chemicals in a laboratory. And then after that, I spent a lot of time analysing chemicals. So I've got a background in organic chemistry and analytical chemistry. And I've worked in forensic chemistry for probably about 20 years or so, in a range of different things, criminal forensics as well as for the civil courts. And I've been with Hawkins for about 10 years or so, or just over. And most of my work in Hawkins tends to deal with litigation, matters where there's expert matters relating to chemistry or chemistry-related aspects, or investigations, and this can be on a whole range of things related to chemistry, product liability, failures, etc., and fires. And for my sins, I also manage the Hawkins Birmingham office. So we're one of a number of offices around the UK. What's not actually shown, I realised when I was going through these slides, is our new Ireland, and somebody's got their microphone not on mute. All on mute. We've also just opened an office in Belfast and Dublin as well. So let's move on to the topic for today. What are PFAS? PFAS are a range of perfluoro and polyfluoro hydrocarbons. So the name derives from here, per poly, fluorinated alkyl substances, and that's where the acronym PFAS comes from. So it's a broad group of chemicals. There's a whole lot of different things. Essentially, the alkyl part here just means it's a hydrocarbon, like the constituents of petrol, diesel. The only difference is that some of the carbon-hydrogen bonds have been replaced with carbon-fluorine bonds. And these, we'll get into why they do that, but what happens is effectively, in the naming of them, there's a bit of a mixture these days. They initially started as perfluorinated compounds, and the per simply means every hydrogen has been replaced with a fluorine. My arrow, for some reason here, is going the wrong way around. Going the other way, as is shown here, is extremely difficult. So we can make these carbon-fluorine bonds, but converting those to carbon-hydrogen bonds going the other way is very difficult. And this is really the nub of the whole area of PFAS and why they're a challenge. So official chemical databases, they record specific chemical structures. So we have a couple of chemical structures. So for example, the structure would be recorded in a chemical database. It's given a unique identifier, what we call a CAS number. Some of you may have come across those before. And there are thousands of those of PFAS materials that are recorded in those databases, maybe 3,000-4,000. But the class generally contains probably more like 10, and I've recent estimates probably closer to 15,000 different chemical substances, a number of which this chemical structure that I've shown for this particular one, but for many of them, that structure is not known. They've been fluorinated by some type of industrial process, and the actual specific chemical composition is not known. Two of the most common ones, and this is probably because they were some of the earliest to be adopted into sort of commercial use, is PFOA, or perfluorooctanoic acid. So this is just an 8-carbon chain carboxylic acid, and PFOS, which is perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. So again, another 8-carbon chain, but this time the acid part is made up by the sulfur rather than a carbon. They have slightly different properties, but ultimately they've been used at phenomenal scale in industrial processes for PFAS production, often making other types of PFAS materials. So they're not the only two. They're the two most common, and that's probably because they've been used probably for the longest period. There's a number of other ones, and here I'll bombard you with a bunch of chemical names. All I take away from it is that in the way that we had the variants on the previous slide here, here and here, we have 4-carbon ones, we have 9-carbon ones, 10-carbon, 6-carbon, and some which are a little bit more complicated. So ultimately, these are just a tiny selection of what are out there. And these are the chemical structures which are associated with those. So we've got a 4-carbon one, another 4-carbon one with a sulfur. We have a 9-carbon one here, 10 other variations. This is a more complicated structure. So this is what happens when you start to derivatize and start to make more complicated PFAS compounds. So you can imagine that chemical variety being what it is, and there's potentially 15,000 substances. There's a very big variation, huge variation between the chemical structures. So how do we measure all of that? Well, part of the problem, before we can do anything else really about measuring PFAS, and I'm talking about PFAS in its context of being in the environment in this circumstance, is we have to send our samples to a laboratory, and they use expensive laboratory equipment to test. So this is a gas chromatograph with a mass spectrometer attached. We have to do some sample preparation. We put our sample through it, and we need very sensitive methods. PFAS have become very common, and we'll get into that, but the commonality of their sort of presence in the environment, and that's both in the built environment and outside, means that when you come to a laboratory, testing them is quite complicated and relatively expensive on a cost per test basis. The levels which we're looking for are normally around about parts per billion, parts per trillion. So they're very, very tiny quantities that we're looking for in a laboratory environment. These are the around the regulatory kind of threshold. So these are the areas of interest, particularly parts per trillion. I'll give a little bit of context as what that really means in a practical sense in a minute. But we just go through some of the history of PFAS compounds. So this huge suite of compounds only started from very humble beginnings. Beginning of the Second World War, Dr. Roy Plunkett, he was a chemist at DuPont as it was then. They were looking for different types of refrigerant gases. So as many people will be aware, the hole on the ozone layer being one of the symptoms of it, we produced lots of chlorofluorocarbons. Before they were a big thing for refrigeration, lots of companies were exploring what could be used as refrigerants. One of those was a compound called tetrafluoroethylene, and the chemical structure is shown here. Tetrafluoroethylene is a gas, and they stored it in gas cylinders, unsurprisingly. And one day they thought, this is not right. A cylinder's empty. So they took their cylinder, chopped it in half. Inside was a white, waxy kind of solid. And they tried dissolving it. It wouldn't dissolve in many things. They tried working with it, and it was a very odd compound. After they'd spent a bit of time and determined what it was and how they could actually make it, it turned out that this compound had actually polymerized inside the gas cylinder, probably a metal inside the gas valve. And what they'd made was this polymeric substance of polytetrafluoroethylene. The structure is shown here. The N is however long it is. It can be a long polymer. And that product became what we all know, I think, as Teflon. And Teflon has been used a lot for many things. When they first tested it, they found that it was very resistant to heat compared to other type of plastic and organic materials. It's very resistant to oil, to water-based substances. So it had potential to be a very useful commercial product. And since Teflon was discovered and then commercialized, there's been a huge range of other types of applications, and I'll touch on those in the next slide. But the reason that it works so well is that when you take a carbon-hydrogen bond and you replace it with a carbon-fluorine bond, the carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds with carbon than pretty much anything else. And what that forms is a slightly different phase, if you like. It's probably the best way of looking at it from a lay point of view. So that if I was to mix a liquid PFAS material with water and with oil, we get 3 layers. We get our water layer, we get our PFAS layer, and we get our oil. And the oil and the water do not mix with the PFAS materials. So that makes them extremely appealing when it comes to all sorts of commercial applications, because they resist that water and oil. So carpets is a good example. A lot of carpets are treated with PFAS materials to make their stain resistance very, very high. So in our built environment, in our houses, PFAS materials appear again and again and again and again. There's limited thermal change. So when I make a block of the material, it doesn't change a lot when I heat it. There's obviously a threshold to that, but relatively, it's quite a good material from a mechanical point of view. And mechanically, we can also form very thin films of it. So both of those lead to other properties, and particularly its low friction properties, that mean that it makes a good washer or bearing or other type of material where there's interaction between 2 other types of surfaces, or it can provide a coating onto other materials. So looking at some of the applications, the first one, probably the biggest one, was when the Manhattan Project kicked off. They were trying to enrich uranium, and it's a very demanding, very chemically quite severe process, especially at that time. And they were having a lot of problems with seals on things, and they found they could use Teflon to make those seals. So it became used quite extensively in the Manhattan Project. We all recognize our average non-stick frying pan. I think most of us have one of those somewhere hiding in a cupboard. I would suggest that nowadays the advice would be, if it's scratched and the surface is peeling off, throw it away and get another one. Don't keep it. Outdoor fabrics, lots and lots of outdoor fabrics, perhaps most notably the Gore Corporation, who made all the Tex fabrics. Gore-Tex is effectively a fabric which is made with PFAS, or effectively Teflon type material, on the outside coating, hence it resists water. But what's very useful about it is that it's a woven material, so not only does it resist the water, but it also breathes. So the water that forms on your body as you exercise outdoors moves through the fabric and outside, and that's caused a revolution really in terms of the outdoor industry. More mechanical uses, gaskets, seals. Its chemical resistance, it's used a lot in laboratory settings for working with very demanding, very severe chemicals. Food packaging has become a huge area of application, and not just food packaging, but a range of packaging applications. Most of you, I think, will have seen, or if not eaten yourself, popcorn that you buy from the supermarket comes in a bag, you put it in the microwave, you zap it for a while, and eventually your popcorn pops, you open the bag and pour it into a bowl. The inside of that paper bag, given it's a paper bag, is normally lined in a PFAS material because it's oil resistant. So we can put our oil in there to cook the popcorn in, and it doesn't leak out, it doesn't come out through the paper. But the paper allows that bag to breathe slightly as that popcorn's heating. So there are many, many applications in food. Water treatment's another. The list goes on and on and on. I'll cover one of the other key applications shortly. So the market for PFAS currently, the best figures I could find were probably around $40 billion a year, give or take. So it's a fairly large market, and that's generally because they spread across such a wide range of different applications, from semiconductors as well as another industry. There are many, many industries that use these materials, and trying to find less toxic, safer, more environmentally friendly alternatives is quite difficult. It's quite expensive. It's quite time consuming. And PFAS as a contaminant or a pollutant has only really recently sort of come to the front. So these companies are now looking for alternatives, but that process does take time. And the cleanup costs are significantly more expensive than the cost of just producing the material. So that means, of course, that there's some barriers there to the cleaning up where it's possible. The main companies that have produced PFAS materials, the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, I don't know how many of you are aware of them, the 3M Corporation, as we might more often will recognize it. The other one on this is Daikin. There's a few others here. They've all made PFAS materials for a range of different applications, and these are probably the largest global producers of PFAS materials as it stands, but there's a lot of custom synthesis that's done as small fluoropolymer makers here in the UK, other places that will also produce materials, not just these companies. So it's got a wide reach. It's become so spread around the globe from our usage and from its spread through the environment, shall we say, that it's now commonly found in samples taken in the Arctic and the Antarctic. But the one challenge is, as I alluded to at the beginning, the testing of these substances is expensive. It's a very pricey process, and that limits to some extent the amount of sampling that's done. But based on sampling which has been done, a collective of both sort of public science organisations and various journalist organisations, I think Le Monde published the original map here, and you can look at this online through the link. But what you can see is you can zoom into your local area and see who sampled for PFAS, and if they found it, what levels were present. The levels of interest for all of sort of Western Europe, for us, really, the River Wye is a hot point. The sediments in the River Wye near Thornton Cleveleys, it's in the proximity of a production plant. That's normally where we see the highest levels. In the UK, I'll come back to sampling, but there's not actually that high levels when you compare to other parts of Europe. The darker the colour on this map, the more PFAS contamination is present. And as you can see here, this little blob that pretty much covers most of Belgium is, as it's understood, probably the most contaminated, PFAS contaminated country in Europe. The sort of focal point for that is and forgive me because I don't speak Dutch, is in a town called Zundert in Belgium. And that's where 3M had a manufacturing plant for a long period and a big manufacturing site. So that site is heavily contaminated with both the soil, the groundwater, and obviously anything which derives from those. So livestock which grazes on that ground, trees, vegetables, all those things move through the food chain. So that area is particularly problematic. And I'll touch on what they have actually recommended for residents who live in that particular area. The other one within Europe that's interesting is Schiphol Airport. And Schiphol Airport is notable because they had, not only do they obviously have a firefighting service, they do a lot of training, they also had an incident where they lost a lot of firefighting foam. And firefighting foam, particularly for fighting fuel and oil fires, PFAS materials make really good foam. They make fantastic foam. And for firefighting in those types of circumstances, it's amazing. It's basically the best thing since sliced bread. So it's been used all over the world, and particularly in military settings. So particularly at airports, but also other types of military settings, general civilian airports. That's where you commonly will find really high levels of PFAS contamination, particularly in the uncontained ground runoff water, so i.e. the groundwater or the soil around those sites. Schiphol is one example, but a bit closer to home, Jersey Airport, the bit where the training ground was is sort of an elevated level, and the firefighting water would run off, and that water is run off containing PFAS materials, contaminated the groundwater, and also the people who live in the area at the end of that airfield, and their blood contains significant levels now of PFAS as well. So firefighting foam is a big problem, and because it's so good, it's been quite difficult to find alternatives. So there's been efforts to look. It's quite difficult to find an alternative chemical which is adequate in terms of environmental and sort of ecological standpoint. But as I say, the firefighting foams seem to be one of the biggest ones, and they're quite rapidly in a number of places being phased out. They're going to non-PFAS based foams. So as you can imagine, that means that the spread of PFAS is probably much greater than the map I showed you earlier, because it depends what areas have been sampled. And when and the same has occurred in Australia. Again, military bases. This was in Australia where they had military bases, where they've got military airfields, and the firefighting foam has run off, spread by combination of the runoff and also just general flooding. Heavy rainfall in Australia, flooding is a not uncommon problem, and the population again being found with high levels of PFAS in the blood. It also gets there and into us and into animals and other places through the use of packaging. I mentioned food packaging before. There's a notable case in the US where, and it was settled, where a particular company called Enhanced Technologies produced containers that didn't produce pesticides, they just produced containers. The company that made the pesticide bought said containers, filled it with their pesticide, and then aerial sprayed it across vast swathes of an area to deal with a mosquito-borne virus. It was very effective. It dealt with the virus, dealt with the mosquitoes. However, it also spread an awful lot of PFAS everywhere. And that was detected in groundwater, in soil, and a number of other places, and subsequently in the blood samples of the population who live in those areas. And it was traced to the containers. Now, in the case of pesticides, unlike foods, there's probably a few things in the pesticide which could actually help the PFAS to leach out of the lining of the container. And it was such a serious issue that US EPA, which is a very unusual thing, earlier this year, put a prohibition order to stop that packaging maker from producing certain types of PFAS products. And that was on the basis that it was contaminating groundwater. So that was prevention of environmental pollution. In the US, that's a pretty unusual step to have taken, and I imagine it would have had quite an impact on the company Enhance and their bottom line as well. So globally, it's all over the place. You can see in the top map, there's lots of samples here taken across the US. You can see the mid-US, Midwest particularly, there's not a lot of sampling. There's not that there's no PFAS, there's just not many samples taken. The bottom map is kind of like a heat map that shows where samples have been taken, and it's a real sketchy picture, really sketchy picture. What you'll note is that the UK has actually almost no colour on it. That's because we haven't actually done very much sampling. So although we say we don't have much of a problem necessarily in the UK, we probably don't really know because we probably haven't looked all that closely. So globally, though, everywhere, what's not shown on this is that samples have been taken in the Arctic, in the polar regions, the Arctic and the Antarctic, and found PFAS present in particularly biological life forms. And then you come to the issue of how do we get rid of it? Well, it's difficult. It's really cheap to make. I mean, I've said £1,000 a kilo. It depends on the product. It could even be a few £100s per kilo. It's not very much. It's really cheap to manufacture. Destruction, figures vary. The challenge with destruction is that you have to break the carbon-fluorine bond in most cases. And that's a very strong bond. And from just a conservation of energy point of view, as a chemist, that's difficult, and that effectively just means cost. That means it's expensive, it's difficult to actually do it, But if you can do it, it's going to be costly. And when it comes to dealing with technologies to remediate PFAS, particularly in the environment, so groundwater, artesian water sources, soil, the question is, do you extract the PFAS out of it, process it, put it back in the ground, but having stripped the PFAS out and then you treat it, or can you find a means to treat it in situ? And there aren't good, clear answers on that as yet, especially with the complexities of groundwater. It's a very, very complicated thing. The costs for destruction, potentially 100 times or more the cost per kilo of actually production of the material in the outset. So that sets a difficult landscape, I think, in terms of remediation and getting to a place where we don't have to worry about it. So it sort of gives a really whiz-bang summary through where we're at, I think, globally in terms of PFAS, and a little bit within the UK. Within the UK, there's been relatively little discussion about PFAS. It's starting to appear more commonly, particularly within utilities, water providers. Some water providers will record that whether they have a PFAS contamination event. Some of them don't report it. If you look at the aggregated quarterly or annual figures for different water utilities in the UK, some of them will report PFAS on their list, some of them won't. So we're quite hit and miss really in the UK. And there's some reasons why we need to get better at it. And that comes down to what does it probably do to us and the environment around us. So the toxicology side of things, and I'll just add here that I'm not a toxicologist, so I'll just touch lightly on these points. But lots of studies have looked at the health effects of PFAS compounds. Many of these have been in animal subjects rather than in people. Tends to be a few ethical challenges to that. But the accepted position in terms of the toxicological effects of PFAS compounds has been they generally are considered to be a carcinogen, so they are cancer causing, particularly to organs and reproductive parts of the body. Thyroid disease is also suspected to be linked to exposure to PFAS, along with autoimmune disorders. And these things are often very difficult because they're often masked by other types of chronic health conditions or other types of health conditions. And perhaps more interestingly, there's quite a suggestion that it has a part to play in heart disease and actually obesity as well. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? The challenge is it lifestyle factors or is it the PFAS that's caused the problems? And so that's a difficult question to answer, I think. Depends on the individual. The toxicological effects can happen at really quite low levels. Most regulation looks at threshold levels because of the biological implications of ingesting PFAS compounds in the order of parts per trillion, the PPT. This is a difficult measure to try and think of in your head, and what it practically works out to, and I tried to do some back of the envelope estimation here, so forgive me if I'm out, but it's probably about 1 gram mixed with about 400 Olympic swimming pools full of water, or a meter of your journey from here to Saturn. So it gives you a picture of just how little amount that it really is, and also that is quite challenging. I'll touch on what other things we consider to be toxic and what levels they are controlled at. But the units that you'll see, and it's particularly relevant when you deal with regulation and legislation, is they'll normally set a limit down here in some sort of international system of units measure, so grams and kilograms or grams and litres. This is micrograms per kilogram. This is nanograms per kilogram. And when we look at what happens to those very low levels is that they obviously aggregate, and many of us are well aware of mercury. It enters our aquatic environment. It can be quite low levels. It can occur in vegetation and other types of vegetable matter. Those primary consumers feed on the vegetarians. All the herbivores will feed on it. They aggregate it. Then the secondary and tertiary kind of animals will then consume those animals and so on, and then put us somewhere up the top here, along with the tertiary consumers. We're ingesting the consequence of all those other things ingesting PFAS. So it's aggregating in a very similar way in which mercury has caused problems historically. It aggregates up the food chain. So we are especially at risk even if the environment around us is much less so. And for various reasons, they're generally been termed forever chemicals. This is a common handle you hear used to refer to PFAS substances. And it's because they take a long time to break down. We've accumulated these over the period since the beginning of the Second World War, and it could take 1,000, 10,000 years to fully, if we stopped today making any more, to remediate what we've produced already. And that has a knock-on effect in the body. As I said, the carbon-fluorine bond is a difficult bond to modify, to break. So our body isn't great at doing it. So generally, like certain types of metals, we tend to excrete it rather than actually break it down. This data here is what they estimate to be the half-life. So the time it takes for half of the quantity of PFAS in your body to be broken down or excreted by your body. So PFOA, the 8-carbon chain, and PFOS, we're looking at somewhere between sort of probably high, I'd say the balance of this is probably closer to 10 rather than 2. So let's say about 7 to 20 odd years as a median point for our bodies to remove half of the PFAS we've accumulated over time. Some of the other ones, it's a bit quicker. So that this is the 6-carbon one is only a few years. The 9-carbon one is less than a year. We're getting much smaller figures, and the 4-carbon one is in terms of hours. However, depending on how long it's there, there's also a factor which one hasn't accounted for here, which is what damage it does while it's in the body. So if we have the 4-carbon one and it only hangs around for a few hours, how much are we being exposed to, and what's the actual toxicological impact of that particular compound? So it might be there for a little while, but does it do more damage perhaps than the 8-carbon one? This is stuff which is all under investigation and is being studied in a lot of depth. And I don't think there's absolute clear-cut evidence to say exactly what's happening just yet, but it will come in the next probably 2 to 5 years, I would say, at the very latest. And across the US, when they've measured blood samples, they found quite a lot, parts per billion. So that's 1,000 times more than our parts per trillion. So population is got contamination, and that's in their blood. So whether it accumulates in different parts of the body at different levels, so the organs may accumulate more of it, but in the blood samples, that's almost 5 parts per billion. That's a very, very high level for a population to have. Now, the mean of the population is a lot less than that, but there are a number of individuals who have had that level of exposure. So that's quite concerning. And in the polar regions, when they've looked at other species, penguins, polar bears, seals, seabirds, some of which basically spend 90% of their time flying, they all have been found to contain very measurable levels of PFAS compounds in their blood. Interestingly, a study in Antarctica, British Antarctic Survey, along with others, drilled a great big hole down through the ice in the Antarctic, and they took this ice core out, and then they could work out timeframes on the ice core, and they looked at what PFAS compounds they could find within it. And since the mid-2000s, they've seen a particular increase in the C4 and the C7 PFAS compounds. So given that's Antarctica, we're a long way away from any clear usage, production, anything else. So that's moved through the environment in some way or another. And as a clue, perhaps, as to how it does that, we could look at the measures that were taken in Zwijndrecht in Belgium, where we had the 3M plant. And these are the recommendations that were made pretty much on the area of the highest concentration of PFAS material. So what I'd call a heavily polluted area. The way it translates is that these are called no regret measures. And you can look these up on the internet, and these are public health information. Excuse me. And these are what they recommend. Eat a varied diet. Don't eat the same thing. Wash your fridge. Produce, they mean vegetables. What they're saying is don't grow your own vegetables. Don't grow anything on your land. Don't grow livestock. Don't grow vegetables. If you do, don't eat it. Minimize your contact with food packaging. Again, the issue of homegrown livestock. Don't consume or very heavily limit your consumption of organ meat. And preferably no organ meat from any of the livestock or their products, so things like eggs that are grown on that contaminated land. Don't use non-stick materials in the house where it's in contact with food. So that's things like Teflon pans, not silicone, but Teflon-based non-stick kitchen products. Don't use the groundwater. That means don't use it for anything. That means don't use it for washing your car. Don't use it for watering your garden. Don't use it. Leave it there. Interestingly, avoid blowing soil. So open, dry, dusty ground. Don't let children play in those kind of areas. Everyone should avoid that soil. So, and increase your exercise, i.e., your chance of getting rid of it, excreting it out of your body. So it's a pretty grim list when you think, actually, you don't tend to think of Belgium as having great issues with that sort of thing. And this is the public health guidance, and it's watered down a little bit as you go slightly further away and the contamination levels reduce. But I think it gives us a good understanding of where those things are coming into sort of exposure with our bodies. And there are recommendations if you grow livestock there in the most contaminated area, that's it. You can't do anything with it. If you grow livestock in the next zone out, you're allowed to sell those products, the eggs, meat, that sort of thing, but you have to make sure that I think there's an issue that you can't sell to the same person, or you have to dilute that within the market. So you have to mix it with product from somewhere that's not contaminated. So there's a lot of issues there, and it shows, I think, the complexity of dealing with this issue. And to try and deal with it, there's been some efforts in regulation, and the regulation is really mixed. Different jurisdictions have tried different things. Some are further ahead than others. I'll touch on just a quick whiz over sort of the key jurisdictions, which I think would find of interest to this group. But regulation is changing in lots of different places, and it's very much a moving feast. This is legislation that's happening, and for any of you who've joined this meeting who've had any exposure to that, you'll be well aware of just how fast that system is changing, and it depends very much on the jurisdiction in which the matter you're dealing with is located and what their kind of local issues. It's very much driven by what the population has got very energized about, and that those places tend to have the strongest regulation. The places with the population's not paid much attention tend to have the weakest regulation, give or take. So I'll just touch on regulation in the US, the EU, and the UK. Just to give you a sense of how much is a lot or not, is the UK drinking water limits. So this is the legal framework which all our drinking water must be provided under. And there are limits in that for lead of no more than 10 parts per billion. Mercury, 1 part per billion. So you'll recall that we were talking about thresholds, toxicological thresholds of parts per trillion. Well, this is 1,000 times more for mercury. So that's how much more of a problem PFAS compounds are. Some of you may be aware of polyaromatic hydrocarbons. These are species that often come from burning materials. There are some other sources. These are limited to 100 parts per trillion. And total pesticides, that would be an aggregate of all the pesticides that could get into the water supply, and they aren't allowed to be more than 500 parts per trillion. So it gives you a bit of a sense when we're looking at the numbers before, and I'll touch on these numbers with the regulation, as to just how toxicologically significant PFAS compounds actually are, albeit there's been little discussion about them. In the USA, if we touch on them first, because they're probably at a regulatory approach further along than many other places, the state, as is always the case, the state and the federal level are very different. The federal level, you've got some federal piece of legislation. I've listed them there. The one that I'll touch on briefly is the Safe Drinking Water Act, but obviously there are other ones. The National Defence Authorization Act, which is this one at the bottom, is particularly pertinent because, of course, military bases, military airfields use PFAS-containing firefighting foam. So they are a very significant source of contamination in many places, which is why that act is particularly relevant. And there's been lots of different approaches. What's distilled out has been that the US President Biden earlier this year said that every American deserves to be able to turn their water tap or faucet and be able to drink clean water. That's pushed the US EPA to set safe drinking water limits for PFOS and PFOA of a maximum combined total of 4 parts per trillion. And for the other compounds of PFAS, a limit, and there's a special formula that they have to use, of 10 parts per trillion. So bottom line is, that's not very much. When we look at our levels of mercury, that's 1,000 parts per trillion. Lead, that's 10,000 parts per trillion. Total pesticides, and you think of, would you really want to be drinking a pesticide? That's 500 parts per trillion, and yet we're setting these limits at 4 parts per trillion. That's a very, very low level. The hazard index is what they've used, the EPA's used for other things. So anyone who's dealt with claims in the US might be aware of that. The same hazard index will be used for PFAS compounds. State level, very different, very patchwork. Michigan has got one of the lowest, and that's set a limit of 8 parts per trillion for PFOA and 16 parts per trillion for PFOS. The US EPA target is 0 parts per trillion of PFAS in drinking water. Whether you can measure, you can never measure 0. So the question is, how low can we measure? That's something I've not yet actually managed to determine. We can measure down to a part per trillion. How much lower than that? I don't know, practically speaking. It's an interesting goal to set. Whether it's achievable, well, I don't know. The EU regulation is definitely behind. The current limits are 500 parts per trillion for all PFAS compounds in drinking water, or 100 parts per trillion for an aggregate of 20 specific PFAS compounds, of which PFOS and PFOA are some. The European Food Safety Authority has also put some limits on, and they've said a tolerable weekly intake. So that's 4.4 nanograms per kilogram body weight per week. So for a light adult or a heavier teen, we're looking at 60 kilos person, we're looking at 264 nanograms per week. That's not much material. So that's a very low level. I think the EU drinking water limits will probably drop quite sharply quite soon. And in the UK, the UK Drinking Water Inspectorate has set a limit of less than 10 ppm, 10 parts per trillion, that do nothing, carry on. Less than 100 parts per trillion, watch it, be careful, don't have to do anything, but just keep monitoring. Greater than 100 parts per trillion, you've immediately got to notify the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and you have to take action. Now, that action could be take the water that's coming from a contaminated source, mix it with uncontaminated water, and bring it under 100 parts per trillion. And that is acceptable. The UK guidelines at the moment are very loose in comparison to what's being set down for the US. And to give a context of some other countries, Japan has set a limit of less than about 50 parts per trillion. Australia have just been getting onto this in quite a serious way. Their limits are slightly higher, both Australia and New Zealand, 70 parts per trillion and 560 parts per trillion. Canada has quite strict limits. They're probably the strictest of anywhere. They are 25 parts per trillion for all PFAS, so that's a very low level. China, interestingly, has actually set very low limits, 40 parts per trillion for PFOS and 80 parts per trillion for PFOA. And there's a strong expectation that they will clamp down on all other PFAS as an aggregate quite sharply. So many countries are looking to get rid of the PFAS sources. Firefighting foams, its use in food and product packaging. It's used a lot in cosmetics as well. Your razor blades. For most men's and women's razors, they have a strip that helps it move over the skin smoothly. That's often some kind of PFAS material. And manufacturers are actively seeking replacements. So that's on the way. Litigation-wise, this is kind of where we're at the moment. And those of you who've dealt with it will know a lot more than I will. But I thought it's just worth touching on from an expert point of view, the challenges that we face, which is it's so common in the environment, is how do we know where the PFAS has come from? If there is a case litigated, how do we know where that contamination has originated? And were there any other sources of contamination? And if there were, what are the relative contributions from all of those? The toxicological effects, if we have personal injury claims or other types of claims on the back of what would be toxicological effects, how do we know that the PFAS is the key cause, or is it something else? And the easy one is generally, are there regulatory limits? Have they been exceeded? That's a more simple question. So we need to consider kind of what's happening in other places. In the US, there's a few notable claims that have been settled. These are agreed settlements, is my understanding, so they're not subject to further appeal. DuPont, Chemours is a subsidiary effectively of DuPont because they had to separate out their business. They've settled at about just over $1 billion. 3M have settled a $10 billion claim. BASF, they purchased a manufacturer, so they purchased the liability, and they settled for about 300 million. And there's a current very large case running through the US courts, an aggregated multi-district litigation, and that's not been finalised yet, I don't believe. And that's, I think, that's thousands of claimants. I can't recall how many, but the result of that is not in yet. Most of these claims have been settled with water utilities, so these are not claims in the main that have been specific damage. I think the first one that was settled was around cattle, damage to livestock. Cattle started dying or becoming very sick. So it was settled for a relatively small amount, but that was the beginning. That was just the tip of the iceberg. So we've not seen really much activity in the UK. So that will be one for the future, I think. And it's probably a good point to end there. So I think thank you all for your time and your attention.
Thanks, Jake. That's fantastic. Really, really interesting stuff, and not a little bit worrying, if I may say. We did have a couple of questions come in on the chat. I think you might well have answered one of them at least, but there's a question from Jason McGinley. Jason, I'm glad you were able to get in, by the way. Question is progress and extent of PFAS replacement being monitored against all manufacturers?
Well, the regulation is really where it falls down, because manufacturers will do what they're required to by regulation, and there's not really, particularly in the EU and UK, there's not really tough regulation on PFAS other than drinking water. So in terms of, there will be people monitoring how they're progressing in terms of phasing those materials out, but until there's real exquisite regulatory or litigation pressure on things, that's a good reference, Ian. The Dark Waters movie, if anyone gets a chance, that explains a particular incident in the US. I think it's a general trend. I think it's about commercial sensibility in marketing. If you're making those PFAS compounds and you've contaminated all sorts of places, it's going to be difficult to dig yourself out of that hole, so best you just change your products. So I think there'll be quite a strong push from a customer point of view, to be honest.
Thank you, Jake. That's very helpful. Thank you. The other question, which possibly is one for more wider discussion, particularly input from any lawyers that are on the call, it's really about the question of burden of proof, I suppose, really. And it's from Paul Steventon. In view of the widespread use of PFAS, how easy will it be to identify the prime cause for any illness or disease claim to be successful? So an issue around causation. Jake, I wouldn't necessarily expect you to.
No, it comes back to one of the slides I had earlier, where I touched on that, where ultimately it does come down to its prevalence does make it more difficult. I think it would depend very much on the type of illness. If it's an illness which is, say, thyroid disorder, if it's, say, a thyroid disorder, or it's a cancer, and it's cancer of particularly areas that are known to be very strongly linked with PFAS exposure, so reproductive or organ cancer, it doesn't mean to say that it's not something else, but if the person has extremely high levels of PFAS in their blood or in their organs, or however, whichever part is sampled and tested, you could argue that there's a significantly increased risk. Whether or not you can say it was that chemical that caused this disease, that's like, say, mesothelioma, that would be very difficult. But that same thing would apply for any chemical exposure and any subsequent health impact or disease that follows from it.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else like to chip in thoughts on that particular question around the difficulties around causation? I mean,
I can see a question here from Michael Clothier. It says, assume that there are companies still producing PFAS and it is not yet globally banned. Will it ever be? Well, mercury is really bad. And if any of you are aware of the very drawn out, complicated, and unnecessarily difficult proceedings that surrounded the Minamata Corporation in Japan when it came to mercury, I suspect no, it won't be banned. It'd be very surprising. It's a very useful material. I think what it is, and the same with that mercury still has a place. There's still a use for mercury, and what's changed is that now we use it sensibly. We don't just splash it around, wash in it, use it and everything, spread it everywhere. When we're finished with it, we pour it in the dirt outside. That maturity of use, I think, is what will come with PFAS as well. And I think that's probably where it's leading to. Don't just dump your waste in the environment. Don't put it in things like food packaging, which will end up in a landfill. Limit the use of PFAS to the applications where it is most beneficial. Use it sensibly, and it's not a problem. Then it can also be managed and disposed of sensibly, and then also not cause a problem. But I think we will see a change in its ubiquitous use in cheap and cheerful stuff. Gore-Tex fabrics that keep the rain off, for example, or stain-resistant carpet treatments, all those sort of things. That's where we may see actually a bigger shift, and that it will be banned from certain types of products.
And presumably there could easily be a sort of consumer-driven market type reaction rather than just a regulatory ban. If there's greater awareness of the risks of PFAS in everyday products that you can choose or not to buy or not buy.
I think that's going to come with maturity of knowledge, and I think that knowledge is growing. And I was listening to some podcasts prior to doing this presentation that were from an Australian journalist, and they were done they started in 2018, I think it was 2018. And it's interesting because the knowledge in 2018 versus 2024, I mean, we are worlds apart in our understanding and knowledge. Huge gap, both in attitude and knowledge and regulation and everything is just poles apart. It couldn't be more different, and that's a relatively short time frame. So I think the change will happen relatively quickly. And Michael's just added to his question: will the consumer know whether the product they're purchasing contains PFAS? Probably not, unless there's a reason for it to be specified in an ingredients list. You probably won't.
Can I just go against that in a way, Jake? Because I've recently come back from America, and on my first day in America, my disposable breakfast bowl proudly proclaimed that it contained no PFAS. So, there is, obviously we're talking in America rather than over here, but it does. I don't know if that's a regulatory thing that they had to observe, or whether they just thought it was
I would be very surprised.
Commercial decision, but it actually specifically stated this product contains no PFAS.
I think this is a commercial decision. I'd be very surprised if there's any regulatory requirement. Many of us will have seen our water bottles, particularly the clear ones, with proudly stating on them BPA free. Nearly every water bottle you buy these days says BPA free. That's bisphenol A. It's a plasticizer. It was used to make production of those water bottles easier. It got condemned as being, and particularly for children or people in vulnerable positions, as being not a great chemical to be ingesting. And so then commercially, the consumer-driven side of it just pushed it out of the market. So then it just got dropped. Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you, Jake. Got a couple of minutes left. If anybody's got any last-minute questions, if you want to sort of articulate them verbally rather than putting them in the chat, you're welcome to do so. We will produce a write-up, and the recording of this will be loaded to the Foil website. You'll be notified when it's up there. Jake's contact details will be on there, so if there's something you wanted to follow up with him directly, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to receive that inquiry. Anything else anybody wants to say? Yes, we'll certainly make sure these slides are available, Michael.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no problem.
And my details are available either through Foil or via the Hawkins website. Just give me a call or drop me an email if you have any questions, or if you think you've got matters which this might relate to. I think this is one for the future, perhaps for the UK, but I think it's definitely a hot topic at the moment. Certainly outside the UK it is.
Thank you. I think we'll finish on that note. So thank you everybody for joining. As I said at the beginning, if you don't already have your own foil account, please do go onto the foil website and register for one. Follow us on LinkedIn. You get lots of information about what foil and its members are up to. And then just big, huge thank you to Jake for that really, really fascinating and, as somebody said, rather scary presentation, but informative. That's the key. That's the key point. So lots of people pressing their hand clapping emojis. So wonderful stuff.
Yeah, thank you to the audience. And don't be depressed. The end is not here. It's not that bad.
But it might be nigh. If it's not actually
it might be. Let's preempt that. Deal with it.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you to everyone. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.